Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day and welcome to the second game of FIDE Candidates 2026. We are covering Sindarov's legendary run in this candidate, and second opponent he's facing is someone from Germany, the underdog of this tournament, Bluebaum Matthias. And he is underdog because he is the lowest rated opponent in this tournament, but he is 2698, almost 2700 rated. Of course, he is a great grandmaster. So yeah, let's see how it continues. Sindarov with white plays e4, and blue bomb played knight e5, knight f3, and knight to f6, the Petrov's defense. And it serves very well because you are the underdog, you are trying to get in equal position out of the opening, and you're black. So what else you want? You want very much equality from black side, right? Knight takes e5. Okay. d6, knight to d3. So knight to d3 variation, knight to f3, knight e4 and d3 and d4 are the most popular uh, continuation here and been analyzed multiple times. Knight to d3 is new trend after that 2022 World Championship game between Caruana and Magnus, where Caruana was very successful with this defense. And let's see. Knight takes e4, queen to e2, pinning the knight. So you have to play queen to e7 to unpin. And this is the idea of knight to d3, to go to knight to f4. With the idea of knight to d5, hitting the queen and the c7 pawn. And if you remember correctly, here knight to c6 was played by Caruana against Magnus versus Caruana World Championship. Also the London tournament in 2018. And after knight to d5, knight to d4, this was the counter punch. Knight e7, knight e2, and after knight to d5 back, he played knight to d4 back with the knight c2 check coming up next. So you have to play knight a3, and after knight to e6, stopping knight c7, f3, knight to c5. A lot of horsing around happened, but after eventual d4, knight d7, the position was very much equal, as after c3, c6, the knight has been kicked. And both players basically played very good game afterwards, but it was ended in a draw. So after knight to f4, knight to c6 being one of the ways to continue, but Matthias played c6, which in my eyes, it's more of a simpler way to defend this position. And it has been played multiple times, of course. f3 by white, kicking the knight out. Knight to f6 and pawn to d4. So this pawn on f3 actually dominates the knight on f6 for now, and this pawn on d4 of course gives you somewhat of a better space. In my eyes, d5 makes most sense, which has been played multiple times, but bishop to f5 is the most played move, and this is what he goes for. The point is the queen is pinned, so I am actually threatening to take the pawn on c2 as black. c3 of course, so that was a tempo, bishop to f5. In this position, actually c4 has been tried by many strong players. For example, Carlsen played this against Rapot in Kanze tournament in 2023. He was able to win that game, where Rapot actually had a very good, very dubious piece sacrifice idea, but Magnus played it well. But in our game, c3, more solid approach by Sindarov. Queen takes queen, and after bishop takes queen, h5. So you don't really want to get hit by g4 g5 ideas. It will gain space for white, so h5, stopping that. And a novelty, till this point the game has been following this one game which was played in 2019 between two grandmasters, one grandmaster and international master, Sovik V and Kacharanov N, where white was able to win after king to f2. It is not really the best move, but it will do. You want to get the king to f2 anyways, so you can start with it. And after knight to d7, h4, white has a very tiny advantage white can claim in this position, because this knight on f4 is very beautifully placed, and this knight on f6 is somewhat of a bad placed knight. There's a pawn on f3 which stops any counterplay. So that was the idea. But after h4, we have knight to a3. A novelty after 4 minutes of thinking from Sindarov. Maybe home preparation, maybe he was just collecting his thoughts, or maybe he was out of the theory because the position is just so simplified. You don't really need any opening preparation in this at this point of the game, even though it's just move number 11. Okay, and after 6 minutes of thinking, here here well, after 6 minutes of thinking, here knight to a6 was played. Now, knight to a6 is a kind of a move which, well, you can make it quite easily. Like I said, it's 6 minutes of thinking from Matthias. He's no way in his home preparation, but uh, it's such a simple move which allows you to capture the knight, give you a double pawn. But most of the grandmaster at that level, well, values their bishop pair in the open position a lot more. So they rarely go for bishop takes a6 ideas. But it is not so simple. After about 10 minutes of thinking, knight to c4 was played. And after this, white black played a really good game. But here I will just show you how hard it can be to play from black side. Black has to be very precise to get an equal position after bishop takes a6. Pawn takes a6. Knight to c4. This is all best moves from white and black side for now. h4 is the best move. If you try to play, let's say d5, which looks more human, it is not a worse move. But then white will have knight to a5, a very strong move, attacking the pawn on c4, c6. And after, let's say, king to d7, now you play h4, stopping any h4 idea from black side. And let's say you start developing bishop to d6, then comes beautiful knight to b7. And I'm gonna get my bishop back when you have a bad pawn structure. Or you play bishop to e7, then I play knight to c5 check, and which actually just forces you to capture because the pawn is hanging on a6. So you capture. And the point is, yes, your pawn structure is horrible. And apart from that, bishop e3, bishop d4 will come in. This knight is beautiful. You cannot kick it out. That bishop will be beautiful. That you cannot kick it out. And very simple b4 idea followed by this somehow rook b1, b3, rook a3 will collect the pawns on a6, a7. So that's a long-term idea that white has, and position is plus minus for white. Well, it is only +1, but it's plus minus. And if you play h4, which is the best move according to the engines, then knight a3, hitting the bishop, bishop to d7, castles, and d5, very important move. It's stopping this bishop from developing, and I would say white has a very nice attack. I mean, very nice structure advantage. Your bishop is, well, not right now, but will be powerful when it comes to f4. Let's say you play, let's say c5, then after a4 or knight to c4 first. Black has a less space, and yes, you have a bishop pair, but your pawn structure is horrible. So white gains a long-term compensation to play against bishop pair. So as you can see, it is not very easy to play this position. But okay, knight to c4, knight to c7, and after knight to e3, attacking the bishop, bishop to h7, we have h4, all normal looking moves. White is playing almost all the top moves. King to d7. Okay, that was played basically within 30 seconds. You could also consider long castle, but okay, king to d7, king to f2, rook to e8, and after almost 9 minutes of think, rook to e8 was played. And here white played g3, which is a good move. But there was a very interesting move, which I'm going to show you because it's a engine move, of course. But the idea is very beautiful. You see, black is always trying to get d5 in. Once you get d5 in and bishop to d6, you are almost always fine. Unless you allow knight d3, knight e5. And that's why black has not played pawn to d5 yet, because he was afraid of knight to d3 to e5 to c5 ideas. So white can actually stop that pawn to d5 permanently by sacrificing the pawn himself. And it is such a strong idea actually. Black has to be extremely precise to play this. For example, let's say if you try to take the pawn, this is actually the best move. Then rook to d1, and I'm simply trying to recover the pawn. And then you will have a weak pawn on d6. So you play rook to e5, just defend it. Then comes the real idea, c4. I'm gonna force you to take the pawn. If you play d4, which is the best move, then after rook d4, well, what did you gain for weakening the pawn on d6? White is just better. But more humanly, if you take the pawn on c4, then after knight takes c4, well, attacking the rook, rook goes back to e8, bishop to e3, attacking the pawn on a7, and let's say you play b5, all top engine moves so far. Knight to a5, a6, rook to c1, all top moves. And let's say d5, so your bishop can come out. Well, then comes a beautiful, beautiful idea which was played in the game also, g3. With bishop f1, bishop h3 coming up, white is almost winning in this position. And you can also see why white is winning. Your knight on c7 is horrible. Your queen side pawns are horrible. Your d5 pawn is almost always just hanging in the air. And white has beautiful development with these two bishops, these two knights, and these two rooks. That was in the air, this pawn to d5 idea. But Sindarov played g3 after 6.5 minutes of thinking. So he is trying to play bishop f1 to h3 idea, knight to e6, and he played knight to h3, not exchanging, d5. And finally, without this knight on f4 coming to d3 to e5, you can play pawn to d5 and get the bishop out. Knight to g5. And of course, you do not want to take, otherwise, after pawn takes, that pawn on h5 hangs. So, bishop to g6. You don't want to give up your bishop pair as well, right? So, bishop to g6 and a beautiful move, bishop to f1. It is actually quite typical in this structure and in this opening that your bishop goes to e2, then later you play g3, put the bishop on back to this diagonal. There is a king there also, so it makes sense. Knight to h7. And after almost 13 minutes of thinking, bishop to h3. Here, you could also consider knight takes e6, because if rook takes, then bishop to h3 is very annoying. Of course, it just wins. So you have to take with the pawn. And after bishop to h3, bishop to d6, let's say, and knight to g2. I'm trying to play bishop to f4. Let's say you play rook to f8. Now, if I play bishop to f4, maybe there are some tricks with e5 and stuff. So let's say play knight to f4 back, attacking the bishop. Yeah, so you play knight to f4. Sorry about that. Attacking the bishop, bishop to f7, and okay, simple developing move, bishop to e3, and then something like b4 is the engine move. I don't really like it, but yeah, and white is better. White has a very nice target on e6 to attack. That pawn on h5 sticks out. That knight on h7 sticks out as well. So yeah, knight takes e6 was possible and perhaps the best move. But bishop to h3 played, which allows knight takes g5, pawn takes g5, and king to c7, unpinning. And here comes knight to f5. It basically stops this bishop from developing. I mean, where are you developing this bishop? d6 or e7? I'm gonna capture it with my knight. So unless you are okay with your bishop on f8 or develop it and then get captured, then you have to take the knight on f5. And this is what played by Matthias Bluebaum after 5 minutes of consideration. And this is what I find really instructive. You actually always have the battle of bishop pair. Who will get the bishop pair first? And neither side wanted to give it up, but Matthias actually finds the exact right moment when to give up the bishop. And after bishop takes, plays g6. Last try, of course, if you don't play g6, white will play g6, and that would be a bad. g6, and after bishop to c2, white has bishop pair. But that knight on e6 and this bishop which will come to e7 or d6 will have a sufficient attack against these pawns, especially the one on g5, that you will have to close down the position with f4. And in fact, bishop to d6 was played, and after bishop to e3, rook to e7, well, you're just doubling the rook, rook a to e1, rook h to e8, f4 was played non-voluntarily, but I mean, there is no other way. You always have to play f4. f5 is the idea, so knight to g7 is stopping it. King to f3. This bishop Even though you have a bishop pair, this bishop just not working, and that's why black can hold this position. King to d7, bishop to f2, desperately trying to make g4 work. Rook takes e1, and of course, you don't want to exchange of all pieces. So bishop takes e1, rook to f8, trying to play f6 or f5, g4, and a beautiful move by black, f5. After only 3 minutes of consideration, you could also take, but after king takes and this rook goes to h7, I can actually hope for something as white. My bishops are getting some activity, and my rook is also getting very much active on h7. So you don't want to allow that, but f5 is a really nice move. In the game, gh5 was played, but if you take on en passant, let's say, then after rook takes, and well, the pawn is hanging, so bishop to d2. Well, I can still capture the pawn on f4. That's the point. And after knight bishop takes, knight e6, we kinda, you cannot really defend the bishop, so you kinda have to just exchange of everything, and well, it's just a draw, 4 versus 4. It's the one side of the board. And apart from that, well, what else you do? If you take the pawn on f5, then knight takes f5, and that's it. I would even say black is looking better because the pawn on f4 is such a weak pawn. But that was the way to continue after takes, knight takes, maybe bishop d2. You can hope for something in this position as white, but it is more risky to play this position. Okay, g takes h5 was played, and after knight takes h5, well, bishop to d2, just defending the pawn. Rook to h8 is a very nice move, and after bishop to d3, rook h7. The idea is now my knight will retreat to f6, and then we will exchange the rooks off. And here Sindarov tried one last trick with bishop takes f5, a piece sacrifice, but it leads to nothing. If you play, let's say, anything else, b4, then knight f6 is a very strong move after takes. Okay, you can play this position, but this is closed position. It actually prefers black, not white. Okay, so bishop takes f5, check. Sindarov playing fighting chess till the end, and after pawn takes g6, attacking the rook, and rook to g7, a good move played by black. But if you play, let's say, rook h8 or rook h7, s6, both same thing, then you see the idea. Yeah, rook takes h5, and black, well, basically have to take this pawn and then suffer for the rest of the game, or you take the rook, then g7, rook h3 check, king f2, very important, so you stop the rook from coming to g3, and when you play rook h2 check, king g3, and well, that's it, rook d2, I get a queen, and rook takes b2. Okay, this is very much like a fortress, but white is the one who is pushing. You will lose the pawn on f5 with series of checks, and the pawn on f4 will survive, so it should be winning for white. Okay, rook to g7, but nice move by Matthias. Rook takes knight, king to e6, another beautiful move. There is no way to defend this pawn on g6. Rook h6, king f6, and bishop e1, trying to get bishop h4 check in, but rook g6. And even if you play bishop to g4 check, I will just play king to g7, and you have to exchange the rooks, and that would be a draw. So rook to h7, trying some 7th rank, but rook g7, and there is nothing more to be done. Check, rook blocks, and after rook s7, rook g7 checks, rook blocks. It was in this position that both players agreed to a draw, or rather it was a draw by 3-4 repetition. So a very strong game by Sindarov. He did miss one opportunity which could have been well, pretty decisive one in this position, to play pawn to d5. That if that would happen on the board, I would say that Sindarov would have won this game. It was not a very hard move to calculate, but you will have to see this move, pawn to c4, and this is very hard move to find. Apart from that, everything else was in Sindarov's level. The c4 was very hard move to find. You have to see that after pawn takes pawn and knight takes pawn, you have a huge compensation. So much so that even engines don't even want to play this position from black. Engines want you to just give up a pawn with pawn to d4. Okay, So that's the game, guys, and I hope you like it. And let's continue the Sindarov saga, and I will see you on the third match of FIDE candidate. Okay, bye.